Thank you for joining me tonight in my library. And on this night, I should like to reflect about and talk a bit about General Robert E. Lee. Now, General Lee was born in January the 19th of 1807. And his father, well, he was born at Stratford Hall in Virginia, ancestral family home. And his father was noteworthy in that he was Light Horse Harry Lee, the commander for George Washington's cavalry in the Revolution. Distinguished military man and dashing leader, distinguished himself. After the Revolution, he did not do so well in business and lost his fortune, and indeed did a year or so in debtor's prison. When he was released from that, he went to the West Indies to try to seek his fortune there and actually died in the West Indies. Now, Robert Edward Lee entered the United States Military Academy in 1825, graduating in the class of 1829. 46 students. General Lee was number 2 of 46, and he had 0 demerits, quite a feat. But there were 5 other cadets in his class of 1829 who also had no demerits. So General Lee was one of 6 with no demerits, but he was second in his class of 46 students. He served various assignments in the southeastern U.S. He met and married Mary Ann Randolph Custis, the daughter of George Washington Parke Custis, grandson of Martha Washington, and owner of Arlington, a large plantation with about 200 slaves. And he had a similarity with me in that Mr. Custis did not try to dissuade Mary from marrying Robert E. Lee, a young Army officer, lieutenant, because his father had been in debtor's prison and he didn't think he could provide for his daughter. Well, they married anyway in 1831, and over the years they had 7 children, 4 boys, 3 girls. None of the girls married. All but one of his children survived him. General Lee died on October 12th of 1870. And all but one of his children, one of his daughters, died in 1862 during the war, and the rest survived him. He was in various assignments in engineering. He went to West Point as a superintendent in 1852. He did not want to go. He tried to get out of it, and the Army said, "You're going to go to West Point." And in fact, while he was there, one of his sons graduated number 1 in the class, in his class. In 1855, when he finished there at his superintendency at West Point, he left the engineers and went with the cavalry and went out west and joined the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, second in command. Albert Sidney Johnston was the colonel commanding. And he was out west fighting Apaches and other Indians. And then he went to, in 1859, he'd been reassigned back to the Washington area. And in October of 59, he was involved in Harper's Ferry. But over the years, his wife had not spent much time or a lot of time with him at his different outposts. She stayed there at Arlington, just across the Potomac River from the capital, much more comfortable. I didn't want to suffer the hardships of Army life. And she was with him a great deal, to be sure, but she stayed there in Arlington. And the slavery issue came up, had been bubbling for a good while. But in 1856, he wrote a letter that I should like to his wife, part of which I'd like to read to you. And this is in 1856, and he says to Mary, "In this enlightened age, there are few, I believe, but what will acknowledge that slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil in any country. It is useless to expatiate on its disadvantages. I think it, however, a greater evil to the white man than to the black race. And while my feelings are strongly enlisted in behalf of the latter, my sympathies are more strong for the former. The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they're undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare and lead them to better things. How long their subjugation may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise, merciful providence. Lee was not an abolitionist. He was not necessarily pro-slavery. He was a man of his times. He, well, in 1857, George Washington Parke Custis died, and leaving the plantation to marry. So therefore, Lee became owner of Arlington. And in the will, Mr. Custis had stipulated that all slaves were to be freed within 5 years of his death. Now, they weren't freed, as it turned out, since 5 years later was in the middle of the war, 1862. They weren't freed, all of them, until 1865 when the war was over. But Lee was trying to free some of them, and Arlington had been a money-losing proposition, could have been profitable. Lee finally, in desperation, exasperation, took leave for 2 years to go back to Arlington and run the plantation, and did well with it. And then he went back into Army service. But he was lukewarm at best on slavery. He didn't care for it, but it was the way life was for him. Well, I want to go back and I must needs talk a bit about the Mexican War. We met during the Mexican War, in the Veracruz to Mexico City campaign in 1847. Captain Lee, he'd made captain by the time the war started. And he joined General Winfield Scott as one of his aides at Veracruz, which is where I too joined General Scott. I saw Captain Lee from time to time. I did not meet him. In the war, though, Captain Lee was brevetted 3 times to Major, Lieutenant Colonel, and Colonel for bravery under fire in 3 different instances. So his brevet rank at the end of the war in 1848 was February 48 was colonel. His real rank was still captain, U.S. Army. And it was on that march from Veracruz to Mexico City that we met. He gave me a good dressing down about not being properly attired, not being military in my appearance, which was ironic because of the way I looked when we met again at Appomattox, covered with mud and filthy. Well, after the war, he was in various assignments, and then went back, as I had said earlier, went to Washington and was in the Washington area in 59, dealt with Harper's Ferry. And then in 1861, he was in the DC area, and his name was being talked about very strongly to be the commanding officer for the United States forces. Winfield Scott was going to retire. He was well past his field of capabilities, still a brilliant man. And he told President Lincoln about Colonel Lee. And Frank Blair was the emissary that approached Lee, and Lee turned it down. But I need to read to enlighten you about this situation, a couple of short items. This is a letter he wrote to George Washington Custis in early 1861. And he said, "The South, in my opinion, has been aggrieved by the acts of the North, as you say. I feel the aggression and am willing to take every proper step for redress. It is the principle I contend for, not individual or private benefit. As an American citizen, I take great pride in my country, her prosperity and institutions. and would defend any state if her rights were invaded. But I can anticipate no greater calamity for the country than a dissolution of the Union. It would be an accumulation of all the evils we complain of, and I am willing to sacrifice everything but honor for its preservation. I hope, therefore, that all constitutional means will be exhausted before there is a resort to force. Secession is nothing but revolution. The framers of our Constitution never exhausted so much labor, wisdom, and forbearance in its formulation, and surrounded it with so many guards and securities, if it was intended to be broken by every member of the Confederacy at will. It was intended for perpetual union, so expressed in the preamble, and for the establishment of a government, not a compact, which can only be dissolved by revolution or the consent of all the people in convention assembled. And that was before the war had actually started. In late May of '61, Francis Blair, the St. Louis Blair family, Frank Blair later became a major general, in fact served under me, was the man selected to approach Colonel Lee, and Lee turned him down after 2 days of walking the floor and consideration. And he in part made this statement to Frank Blair when he declined the command of the United States forces. Mr. Blair, I look upon secession as anarchy. If I owned the 4 millions of slaves in the South, I would sacrifice them all to the Union. But how can I draw my sword upon Virginia, my native state? And with that, he resigned. He was given a brigadier general's rank in the Confederate States Army. And then just a little while later, when they were more thoroughly organized, he was made one of the 5 full generals. He was assigned to command defend Virginia, and was defeated at the Battle of Cheat Mountain in Western Virginia. And then a little later on in June, at the Battle of Seven Pines, Joseph Eggleston Johnston, no relationship to Albert Sidney Johnston, but Joe Johnston was wounded at the Battle of Seven Pines, and Lee was named as a commander to replace Johnston. Initially, I think intended to be temporary, but then it became a permanent assignment. And Lee promptly, this is '62, goes under the peninsula and runs George McClellan out of it. Then he gets involved with the Second Bull Run and beat John Pope. Then the Army of the Potomac had changed generals again and had Joe Hooker, and Hooker is devastated at Chancellorsville. They changed commanders again, named Ambrose Burnside, who had already declined it and said, I'm not worthy. The second time they offered it to him, he took it, and then he worked diligently daily to demonstrate that he was indeed not worth it, capable of the job. And he promptly launches Fredericksburg, the Mud March at Fredericksburg, and is devastated. Then McClellan's back in command, and Lee met him in September of '62, September 17th, the bloodiest day of the war. And he got Lee's orders, number 191, I believe the number was, wrapped in cigars. Lee's complete battle plan, one of the enigmas of history. How did that happen? Why were they wrapped around cigars? McClellan has Lee's entire battle plan. 2 things happened, or maybe I should say one thing happened and one didn't. Lee was advised that McClellan knew his plans, changed all of his plans. What didn't happen was McClellan doing anything. He was so slow and so overwhelmed by all these maniacal numbers that he was being told by Pinkerton in part, that he moved very slowly, and the worst day in American history, bloodiest day in the history of the United States Army, September 17th, 1862 at Antietam. Lee meets McClellan and retreats from the field. Then, by this time, my star was rising, and Lee is not worried about me. He's thinking of what he's going to do to get into the North again. May and June and July of 63, he goes into, while I'm in Vicksburg, he goes the second time into the North to take the war to the North. And he meets George Meade, with who's been in command since June 28th, another commander for the Army of the Potomac. June 28th and July 1st, he collides with Lee, or Lee collided with him at a little town named Gettysburg. And for the next 3 years, the bloodiest 3 days rather, the bloodiest battle of the war is fought. And Lee again is defeated and comes back into Virginia. Well, I was named appointed to the newly recreated rank of Lieutenant General, and that was approved in March. And on March the 9th, I was promoted to Lieutenant General with the 3 stars. And on May the 4th, I began moving 120,000 men in the Army of the Potomac across the Rapidan River, looking to engage Lee. Now, President Lincoln brought me to the east and appointed me Lieutenant General, the only one in the Army, highest ranking officer in the Army, because he thought I could defeat Lee. No one else had been able to. He thought I could. He knew the cost would be high in blood, but he wanted me to go after Lee. Now, my intent, my strategy was that I was going to keep Lee pinned in Virginia so he could not go south and join up with Joe Johnston, and then both of them go after Sherman, who by this time is coming up, or wanting to come up north and rejoin me. So those 2 grand strategies, Sherman in the south wanting to get to me wanting to keep Lee pinned where he cannot escape and join up with Joe Johnston. And beginning with May the 5th of 1864, the Army of Northern Virginia engaged the Army of the Potomac. Now, I was not in command of the Army of the Potomac. I was General-in-Chief, but my orders were to have my headquarters in the field, and it was strongly suggested with the Army of the Potomac, which I did, according to President Lincoln's wishes. From May the 5th of 1864 to April the 9th of 1865, when Lee surrendered to me, there were only, as I recall, 4 days in that 11 months where there was not direct conflict between the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac. It was a bloody, ghastly 11 months. We had pushed Lee back into the Overland Campaign in 40 some odd days into Petersburg. We went into siege in June, mid-June, and from mid-June to August the 2nd of mid-June of 64 to August the 2nd of 65, we were in a siege, semi-siege. I finally was able to break into cut the railroads for Lee, his supplies, and he evacuated Richmond and Petersburg on April 2nd. We pursued him for about 100 miles across to the west, across Virginia, brought him to bay, and he surrendered on April 9th of 1865. Now, after the war, General Lee strongly discouraged guerrilla warfare. He was urged to do it, but he said, no, we will not do this. You have fought honorably, you have surrendered honorably, and you will maintain your honor. And he also said, though, these men will have no supervision, and there's no determining what they may do to do rough and bad things. We lost the war, accept it, and surrender. He wanted to actually retire to a farm, couldn't. He tried looking into railroads and insurance. All those Confederate generals did such things as that, trying to make a living in a devastated economy. And he accepted a position at Washington College in Lexington, Virginia. He signed the day that he took office in 1868, I believe it was, 1865, was the day that he had written a letter also to get amnesty from President Johnson. Now, President Johnson had offered amnesty, but wrote in 68 and wrote 14 different exceptions. Well, General Lee didn't come under any of them. And he had, in 65, in June of 65, he wrote me a letter, wanted to know why was he being indicted in federal court. I didn't know anything about it. I think this was June the 16th of 65. War hasn't been over but 5 weeks. And already Andrew Johnson has moved to indict Robert E. Lee, James Longstreet, and Jefferson Davis. And et al., meaning legal talk and others, which would have ultimately been every Confederate officer right down to the last first lieutenant. And they would have all been tried and given a fair trial and hanged. And when I found out that Andrew Johnson had initiated a federal grand jury and Lee and others had been indicted, I told President Johnson that I would resign my commission from the United States Army before I stood his breaking of my word to General Lee in the surrender. And I told President Johnson, you can't do this. I gave General Lee my word as a soldier that if he and his soldiers went home and obeyed the laws where they lived and didn't take up arms again against the United States, they would not be disturbed. And here you are breaking my word to have him indicted. And it was only when I threatened to resign that he pulled back and backed away from that and directed Attorney General Joshua Speed to have the indictments quashed. He did. The indictments, we heard no more, but I found out later that it was about a week before I took office as president in 1869, in March of 69, that right before he left office, President Johnson had actually dropped and quashed those charges. In the post-war, there, as I said, General Lee had gone to Washington College, and he was wanting us he supported President Johnson's approach to Reconstruction, and he was more pro-slavery than not, but he was rankled by men like Jubal Early and other Confederate leaders who were being very angry about Reconstruction and critical of the U.S. And he wrote this or said this to a magazine editor in 1965, chastising Southern leaders like Early for speaking angrily about the United States government. And he said in an interview, it should be the object of all to avoid controversy, to allay passion, give full scope to reason, and to every kindly feeling. By doing this and encouraging our citizens to engage in the duties of life with all their heart and mind, with the determination not to be turned aside by thoughts of the past and fears of the future, our country will not only be restored in material prosperity, but will be advanced in science and in virtue and in religion. Well, General Lee raised a little college struggling to keep them going out of business into a significant and respected university. He died, he had a stroke in late September of 1870, and he died on October 12th, 1870, and he's buried in the chapel there on the campus of Washington, and they named it. He would not name it Washington and Lee while he was alive, but at his death, they named it Washington and Lee. Buried him in the chapel there at Washington and Lee on the campus, and indeed his wife, who survived him by 3 years and died in 1873, she's buried there, and I think the rest of his family is as well. I'm not certain about that. But he had also, in bringing my comments to a close, I should like to say that right after I took office in March of 1869, in May of 69, General Lee came calling. I wasn't expecting him, but he came calling. He'd been in town on some railroad business, and he came by and we chatted for half hour or so. And we talked of nothing of any consequence. He was wanting me to put some railroads, if I could have some influence into the South and help the devastated economy of the South. And that was the business part that we talked about. But the important part I have always felt of his visit was it was a reconciliation, because as Robert E. Lee went, so went the South. And when General Lee went to the White House to visit his old enemy, General Grant, now President Grant, it said something to the whole South. It said, if I can put this behind me, you should put it behind you. It was a magnanimous gesture of reaching across the lines and shaking hands and making it clear the war is over. We all need to get along. And he left, and I did not see him again. So General Lee was a man of many talents and capabilities, many nicknames. He was called Morris Lee, Granny Lee, because and the King of Spades, because when he first went into the war, he was in charge of the defenses of Richmond, and he had them dig, I think, a series of 3 trenches around the city, and he got the angry nickname of King of Spades, which when I laid siege to him at Petersburg, the people of Richmond really came to appreciate all those trenches that he had dug for defensive lines. Granny Lee, because at first he didn't seem to be aggressive enough. Granny Lee, King of Spades, Morris Robert, Bobby Lee, several nicknames. And I'm well aware I had a few nicknames too. But that's all I should like to say about General Lee, the Marble Man. He got that nickname when he was still in the academy at West Point. General Lee was a worthy adversary and a man of honor. And it's been a pleasure to reflect about General Lee with you here in the library this night. And for the moment, I am General of the Army Ulysses S. Grant, bidding you a fond adieu.